Again, welcome everyone. God's annual holiday season will begin in less than 2 weeks now. So we have around 10 days to prepare for Passover and the days of unleavened bread. Of course, they'll be followed later this year by Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, and of course ending with the last great day. I always get excited every time this year when we begin to rehearse God's great plan of salvation through His annual holy days. It is indeed quite a blessing to see God's plan of salvation in action. God's annual holy days are rehearsals. We rehearse them each year, and year after year, we gain more insight into God's true plan to save mankind. And each year, we grow closer to God. Since we have 2 weekly Sabbaths, including today, before Passover, I thought I would talk about the first Passover, the one with the 4-legged lambs and the Feast of Unleavened Bread also today. And next Sabbath, we'll talk about Jesus Christ and how He became our Passover lamb. The following week, of course, we'll observe the Passover and begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And again, that begins in around 10 days from right now. Let's get started. Let's go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 37, if you would. That's Genesis chapter 37 and verse 3. I think most of us are probably familiar with the story of Jacob, also called Israel, and his 12 sons. Now, his son Joseph was hated by his 11 brothers. Now, why did his brothers hate him so much? Well, again, Genesis 37, verse 3. Now, Israel, also known as Jacob, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Now, that was a very special coat. I'm sure it showed Israel's or Jacob's favoritism for Joseph. Verse 4. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him. It could not speak peaceably unto him. Joseph's brothers came to hate him so much that they could not even talk to him politely, as some translations say. And things got even worse. Verse 5. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. Now, in Joseph's dream, 11 sheaves in the field bowed down to the 12th, and this represented Joseph's 11 brothers bowing down to him. Verse 8. Down to verse 8. And his brethren said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. Joseph dreamed yet another dream in verse 9 that made things even worse, I guess, if it was possible by that time. Joseph's brothers came to hate him so much that they conspired to kill him. Drop down to verse 20, if you would, verse 20. Here's what his brothers said. Excuse me. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit, and we will say, Some evil beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. So they planned to put an end to Joseph and to those dreams. It was Reuben that actually stopped them from actually killing Joseph. Verse 21. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he, Reuben, might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. Reuben was hoping to get them just to throw Joseph into the pit and not kill him. Some translations of our Bibles say that the pit was actually a dry well. Now later, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph from the pit or well and take him back to his father. Verse 24. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Again, this was likely an empty well. Now it happened that a company of Ishmaelites happened to come by, and they were merchants. And Joseph's brothers sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. Turn with me, if you would, to Genesis 39. That's Genesis chapter 39 and verse 1. We'll start at the beginning. Genesis 9. Now, meanwhile, the brothers took Joseph's coat of many colors and dipped it in the blood of a goat. Then they showed the bloody coat to their father and suggested that Joseph had been eaten by wild beasts. Obviously, Jacob was very upset. Let's get back to Joseph. Again, Genesis chapter 39, verse 1. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him out of the hands of the Ishmaelites which had brought him down there. The contemporary English version reads, The Ishmaelites took Joseph to Egypt and sold him to Potiphar, the king's official in charge of the palace guard. So Joseph was now in Egypt, and he was serving in Potiphar's house. Verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master, that's Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Potiphar could see that God was with Joseph and was blessing all that Joseph did. So, verse 4, And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. So things were actually going very well for Joseph when Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of making advances to her. Of course, now following that accusation, Joseph ended up in prison. But then his ability to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams got him out of prison. Now, actually, it was God that interpreted the dreams through Joseph. And eventually, Joseph ended up with a very high position in Egypt. In fact, he became second in command only to the Pharaoh. And then, of course, the famine came that fulfilled the Pharaoh's dream that Joseph had interpreted. Jacob sent all his sons, except Benjamin, to Egypt to purchase grain during the famine. So now, if you would, let's turn over to Genesis chapter 46. That's Genesis chapter 46 and verse 5. Genesis 46, verse 5. Now, Joseph recognized his brothers when they arrived in Egypt, but they didn't recognize him. Joseph then accused them of being spies and kept Simon until they returned with Benjamin. They took the grain back to Jacob, but then, of course, eventually the grain ran out. So what happened then? Well, again, Genesis 46, verse 5. And Jacob rose up from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. And they took their cattle and their goods which they had gotten in the land of Canaan and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt. So, due to the famine, Jacob and Joseph's other brothers came down to live in Egypt, Goshen to be specific. Let's turn over now to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, we'll start there in verse 1. Easy to remember. The beginning of Exodus, Exodus 1, verse 1. I know I've skipped a lot here. This would take a while, but what happened was time passed, and Joseph and all his brothers, eventually, they died. And when they did, well, things stopped going quite so well for the Israelites. Again, Exodus 1, verse 1. Now these are the names of the children of Israel, which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falls out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters, to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So the Israelites were made slaves to the Egyptian rulers. Verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor or cruelty. Some translations say the Egyptians treated them harshly, that they were ruthless. But the Israelites became enslaved to the Egyptians. Verse 15. And the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and you see them upon their stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she may live. So the boys that were born of the Hebrews were to be killed. But did the midwives do as they were commanded? Verse 17. But the midwives feared God, and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said to them, why have you done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? So now it looks like the midwives were in trouble for not killing all the male children. So what excuse did they give to the king of Egypt for not killing the children? Verse 19. And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered meaning before, delivered before the midwives come in to them. In other words, the Hebrew women were having their babies before the midwives could get there. Verse 20. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. Now verse 22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So Pharaoh ordered all the male babies of the Hebrews basically to be killed, to be thrown in the river. Does that sound familiar? We might recall that something very much like that happened when Christ was born and all the male children under 2 were ordered to be killed. Let's continue in the next verse. Exodus 2, verse 1. We're in chapter 2 now. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him for 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. Or, as the easy-to-read version says, she hid him for as long as she could. After 3 months, she made a basket and covered it with tar, so that it would float. Then she put the baby in the basket, and put the basket in the river in the tall grass. So I guess she did put him in the river, with a caveat there. Verse 4, back to the King James. And his sister stood afar off, to wit, what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call to you a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. The woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him into Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the water. So Moses was raised as an Egyptian. After Moses became an adult, he witnessed an Egyptian beating one of his brother Israelites. Well, it ended up that Moses killed that Egyptian. But before the Pharaoh could kill Moses, Moses fled. He ran away. And later after that, Moses helped 7 daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, water their sheep. And Moses decided to stay with her family and ended up marrying Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters. Let's pick up this story in Exodus chapter 3. That's Exodus chapter 3, just one chapter over from where we are. And we'll start there in verse 1, Exodus chapter 3. I believe the movie The Ten Commandments, if you've seen that, I think it does a nice job of telling the story of Moses and the Passover. But of course, there were a few deviations from what our Bibles say, and of course, a few Hollywood embellishments. But overall, I thought it was very well done. But again, Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in the flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. So Moses noticed this bush that appeared to be burning, but it didn't burn itself out. It just kept on burning. I think I would have probably wondered about that. How did this bush get caught on fire in the first place? But the fact it didn't seem to finally burn up would certainly get our attention. Verse 3. I think it got Moses' attention too. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not near here, put off your shoes from off your feet, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And they shall hearken to your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt. And you shall say to him, The Lord God of the Hebrews has met with us, and now let us go, we beseech you, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not by a mighty hand. And I will stretch out my hand, and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof, and after that he will let you go. God told Moses that he would perform many wonders. Well, in fact, these wonders are probably more like plagues on the Egyptians. In fact, Egypt suffered 10 plagues. Now, at first, the Israelites suffered alongside the Egyptians. The Israelites were not removed from the situation. They suffered alongside the Egyptians as the Nile turned to blood. And then came plagues of frogs and then of lice. But then there came a clear division between Egypt and the Israelites, God's people. In verse 21, we see the plague of flies. But at this point, the Israelites were no longer affected by the plagues the Egyptians had to deal with. Let's see that in verse 22. Exodus 8, verse 22. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. More plagues came, but now God kept these plagues from his people. He didn't rapture them or take them away to some foreign land, at least not yet anyway. Instead, he protected them right there where they were. And they were a witness to all that happened to the Egyptians. But God protected his people. Like the plagues that Egypt suffered due to their idolatry and their refusal to obey God, one day in our future, our world will suffer plagues once again in the time known as the Great Tribulation. And just like with the Egyptian plagues, God's people will live in the midst of these plagues. Turn with me to Psalm 91, verse 1. That's Psalm chapter 91, beginning in verse 1. Psalm 91. Let's see what it looks like to be protected by God. Remember that at the beginning of the plagues that were upon Egypt, the Israelites suffered along with them, but they didn't last for very long. Again, Psalm 91, beginning in verse 1. He that dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in Him will I trust. Surely He will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. The word pestilence here is Hebrew word 1696 in Strong's. It's deber in the Hebrew, and it means pestilence or plague. Verse 4. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under his wings shall you trust. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. Now, according to Strong's, a buckler is something surrounding the person. That is a shield, but it extends all the way around us. God promises his people that his truth shall be their shield and their buckler, meaning a shield all around us to protect us in the coming tribulation. What about those that reject God's truth? Well, they, like the Egyptians we're reading about here, presumably will not have that surrounding shield of protection. I would say that it's certainly time to come out of Babylon and the false teachings that many of us have experienced. When things get rough, calling on Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny will be of no help. No, we want to be surrounded by God's shield of protection as the Israelites were when the plague surrounded them in Egypt. We don't want to be in the same place the Egyptians were when their plagues came. And if we reject all the false teachings and all the idolatry we see going on today, and we do truly worship God in spirit and in truth, then, verse 5, you shall not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flies by day, nor for the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor for the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you. Only with your eyes shall you behold and see the reward of the wicked. Like the Israelites that were protected from the plagues that ultimately resulted in the many deaths of the Egyptians, I believe God's people will be protected when great tribulation comes. Again, God will make a difference between those who truly belong to Him and those that don't, just as He did in Egypt. But I would say that right now, the way things are going on in the world, now would be a particularly good time to draw closer to God, to separate ourselves from the idolatry of today's world. Let's pay close attention to these next few verses. Verse 9. Because you have made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, your habitation, there shall no evil befall you, neither shall any plague come near your dwelling. For He shall give His angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways. There will come a time when the earth will be struck with plagues and destruction, but God's people will find refuge in Him. Well, now let's see how God protected or saved those Israelites in Egypt who had death staring them in the face. Let's move ahead in Scripture to Exodus chapter 11 and verse 4. That's Exodus chapter 11, verse 4. Exodus chapter 11, verse 4. The last plague that hit Egypt was the death of the firstborn. But God prepared a way to save His people from this plague of death. Let's see how He did it. Let's rejoin our story in Exodus chapter 11, verse 4. And Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt, And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh that sits upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. And there shall be a great cry, it says, throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. Comparing this to the coming great tribulation, remember what Jesus said about that tribulation in Matthew 24, verse 21. I'll read that. He says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." But notice how God protects his people from these plagues. Verse 7, "But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that you may know how the Lord does put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel." A difference between the Egyptians who followed false gods and those who followed the true God. Death was about to come to all the firstborn of Egypt, but the children of Israel were excluded. Death was going to pass over them that night. Turn over to Exodus 12, verse 1. Let me see here. Yeah, Exodus 12, verse 1. Tell you what, make that Exodus 12, verse 3. Exodus 12, verse 3. And here we'll see how God saved his people, how that first Passover went, how the sacrifice of innocent lambs allowed the Israelites to live that night when the angel of death arrived in Egypt and was all around them. Again, make that Exodus 12, verse 3. "Speak you unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, in the 10th day of this month, they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house." So the Israelites were to select a lamb on the 10th day of the month. Verse 4. "And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb." Okay, but this couldn't be just any lamb. This had to be a perfect lamb without blemish. Verse 5. "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats." So it also had to be a very young male lamb. Verse 6. "And you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening." The lamb that was selected on the 10th day of the first month had to be kept until the 14th day of the month. It could not be killed on the 13th day of the first month or any time before the 14th day of that first month. The lamb was to be killed in the evening. There is some disagreement about what it means to kill the lamb in the evening. Some believe a better translation is between the evenings. Now, some considered noon to be the first evening of the day and sunset the second evening. And some believe that evening, as a verb, means the going down of the sun. That is, from the sun's highest point in the sky, which would be noon, all the way to sunset at nightfall, as the sun made its trip down to the horizon. But for various reasons and beliefs, most believe the lambs were to be killed between noon and sunset on the 14th, in the afternoon hours, you might say. The historian Josephus recorded that the Passover lambs were indeed killed from about the 9th hour until the 11th hour. That's what he says. And that would be what we consider to be approximately from 3 p.m. until 5 p.m. today, assuming a 6 p.m. sunset. And again, sometime between noon and sunset. At any rate, the lambs were to be sacrificed on the 14th day of the first month. We all agree on that. But likely in the afternoon, but before sunset. Okay, verse 7. "They shall take of the blood and strike it on the 2 side posts and on the upper doorposts of the houses wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat that flesh in that night." Now, if the lambs were killed in the afternoon of the 14th, then if they were to be eaten that night would actually begin the next day on God's calendar. And that would make it the 15th, right? That means the sacrificed lambs were eaten after dark at the beginning of the 15th day of the first month. Once again, verse 8. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, again during the beginning, the dark portion of the 15th. Roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and with the purtenance thereof. So the lamb was to be roasted whole, which would likely take several hours to cook over a fire. Verse 10. You shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remains of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. And thus shall you eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. We know that the death angel would arrive sometime around midnight that night, the night of the 15th. A lamb killed in the late afternoon and cooked whole for several hours over a fire would likely have them eating that lamb late into the night of the 15th. The Israelites didn't just eat their lamb at sunset and lie around waiting for midnight to arrive. They likely ate their lambs later that night as midnight drew near, and so they needed to be ready to leave Egypt in a hurry. That's why they were ready to go. They ate it in haste. Verse 12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And that's all the firstborn, even the firstborn of the animals. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. The Israelites will be saved from death by the blood of a sacrificed lamb. Those with the blood of the lamb on their dwelling that night would have death pass over them. They'd be passed over by death. They'd be saved by the blood of a lamb. And, of course, as should be expected with God, everything went to plan. Everything happened just as he said it would. Of course, God, through Moses, then delivered his people out of Egypt on the 15th day of the first month. We'll be looking at the exodus of God's people from Egypt during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So we'll get to that. Let's continue on here today. But, this wasn't the end of being passed over. This passed over wasn't to be forgotten. In fact, God commanded us to remember this event as a memorial forever, and on the 15th day of his first month. Verse 14. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial. You shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. The day that the Israelites were passed over was to be a memorial forever. And this day was, of course, the 15th day of the first month. And so we're to observe this day each year in remembrance of those Israelites that were freed from their bondage in Egypt, and to remember that those that were saved by the blood of the Lamb. And also to remember that God had rescued those in bondage from Egypt and set them free. He set them on their journey to the promised land, just as he will one day take us out of sin to live with him in his promised kingdom. But there's even more to this observance. Let's continue in verse 15. What else does he tell us to do besides the one day? Well, 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eats leavened bread from the first day unto the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. We know that's serious. Verse 16. Then the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save that which every man must eat, that only may be done of you. So here we see the first annual holy day of the year defined, and also the second, the 7th day. Verse 17. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Excuse me. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, when is that? Well, that's at sunset on the 14th, making this the beginning of the 15th. So at that time, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. And it's not just the bread that it's not just we need to eat unleavened bread every day during the 7-day period. We're also to remove all leaven from our dwellings. I really suspect that cleaning the leaven out of our homes each spring morphed into what many call spring cleaning today. Although really no one seems to know where that tradition came from for sure. I suspect that's where it came from. What do you think? Verse 19. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses. Now the word houses here in the Hebrew is the word bayith. It doesn't necessarily mean just the physical structure of a house. It could mean court, within or without. We find the word steward in its definition. That leads me to suspect that we should have no leaven on our property, what we control. And of course, that would extend to our vehicles as well. Again, Exodus 12, verse 19. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses. For whosoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger or born in the land. You shall eat nothing leavened, and all your habitations shall you eat unleavened bread. Okay, drop down to verse 24. Verse 24. And you shall observe this thing for an ordinance to you and to your sons. Again, how long? Forever. The Eternal doesn't specifically ask us to do very much as far as rituals are concerned. He doesn't ask a lot of us. He does ask us to rid our dwelling of leaven for this 1 week and to eat unleavened bread each day during this period. Unleavened is called the bread of affliction in Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. When the Israelites left Egypt in haste, they had no time to let the dough rise, so they ate unleavened bread. But how could they bake the unleavened bread without ovens? Well, let me tell you a story. A few years ago, a Jewish couple told me that the Israelites actually spread the dough on their backs like a paste as they were on their journey. I guess like you might apply sunscreen. Anyway, they say it baked in the hot sun until the dough became hard like crackers. Didn't have any ovens on the journeys they fled Egypt. Rather, the heat of the sun baked it directly on their backs. My friend told me that's why they make matzos salty today, because the sweat on the Israelites' back made the bread salty. And that's why they call it the bread of affliction, one reason anyway. But at any rate, we're told to remove the leaven from our dwellings and eat unleavened bread for 7 straight days to remind us of how the Israelites left Egypt. Verse 25. And it shall come to pass, when you be come to the land which the Lord will give you, according as he has promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall come to pass, when your children say to you, what mean you by this service? Then you will say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. And the people bowed the head and worshipped. Of course, our children will never ask us about the Lord's Passover if we never observe it. On the night of the 15th, death struck the firstborn of the Egyptians, but not one of the Israelites died. Rather, they were passed over by the death angel, saved by the blood of a lamb. And then they left the bondage of Egypt for the promised land. Drop way down with me to verse 46, if you would. Yeah, that's verse 46. I want to make a quick point before we leave this area that no bones of the Passover lamb were to be broken. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but this foreshadowed the coming of Jesus Christ, our Passover lamb. Prophecy in Psalm 34, verse 20 tells us regarding Jesus Christ, he keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. So with that in mind, verse 46. In what house shall it be eaten? That's the Passover. You shall not carry forth aught of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall you break a bone thereof. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it, meaning the Passover again. But the Israelites were not to break any of the bones of their four-legged lambs. We'll talk about this next week, but we might remember that the soldiers at Jesus' crucifixion were told to break the lambs, the legs, not the lambs, told to break the legs of the crucified that they might die quickly, so they could be taken down from their crosses or stakes before that high Sabbath day began at sunset. When they came to Jesus, of course, they saw he was already dead, so they did not break his legs. In fact, none of his bones were broken, just as the prophecy in Psalm 34, verse 20, and the instructions to not break any bones of the Passover lamb foretold. Okay. Let's get back to the leaven. Now, we're told to remove all the leaven from our dwellings during this 7-day period of unleavened bread. The leaven is analogous to being puffed up, as in being puffed up with pride. We see a lot of that today. But the leaven represents sin during this 7-day period. Now, I know we really try hard to eliminate the leaven from our homes, just as we try to eliminate the sin in our lives. But what often happens after we think we've removed all the leaven from our homes? What happens to us, especially in the beginning? Well, often later we find something that was hidden. Sometimes after the fact, right? Some we missed. And that's much like the sin we think we've eliminated from our lives. Like the leaven, we might just find some sin left in us after we think we've eliminated it all. But both the leaven and our sins are very difficult to completely eliminate. And more on that in just a second. But what is leaven? What are we supposed to remove from our homes? Well, leaven is practically anything that's added to flour or dough to cause it to puff up. Leaven can be biological, like yeast, physical, like beaten egg whites, or chemical, such as baking soda. All these agents puff up bread. So before the first day of unleavened bread, we need to inspect our pantries, our freezers, refrigerators, and other food storage places and remove any product that has leavening agents in it. We might need to look at some other places as well, and we should probably check the labels of certain types of products carefully. Some things I'm told that people often miss are self-rising flour, chow mein noodles, wheat thins, and some other flat crackers that have baking soda in them. Now, there are some things that have baking soda in them that I personally believe we can keep. You might disagree with this. I'm talking about things like toothpaste, deodorant, pet food, perhaps baking soda used to deodorize our refrigerators or to treat water for hot tubs or pools. These are not intended to be food for us, and they won't contribute to puffing up our food like bread. Well, that's my understanding on this anyway. As always, we should be convicted to do whatever we believe God directs us to do. But we still have a little over a week to get the leaven removed from our homes. And don't forget about our vehicles too. They might also contain leaven, especially if we eat in our vehicles. I know many of us do today in our hurried world. Now, you might be saying this analogy may not be quite perfect because we know we can never get sin completely out of our lives, no matter how hard we try. Wasn't it Paul that told us that all sin comes short of the glory of God? But that should not keep us from doing our very best to eliminate as much sin as possible. What about the leaven in our homes, which represents sin during the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Well, like our sin today, we cannot totally get rid of the leaven in our homes either. Did you realize that? A while back, a good brother and sister from Canada informed me that wild yeast is just floating around in the air everywhere. This wild yeast is already present in the air in our homes and can actually be used in making bread rise. So even if we're successful in removing all the leaven we can find, there will always be some left floating around in the air. Invisible to us, perhaps, just as our sin can often be. But in both cases, removing sin from our lives as well as removing the leaven from our homes during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we always need to do the very best we can to eliminate them both. I do believe there are very important lessons to be learned by removing the leaven from our homes during this 7-day period. And as always, God knows what he's doing. Before we end today, let's take a brief look at that sacrificed lamb again. I'd like to look at some specific characteristics of the lamb. If you're taking notes, you might want to write these down because we'll be referring to them next week. We'll be matching them up with our Passover lamb. So, the Israelites were saved from death by the blood of a lamb on their doorpost. Of course, we know that. Now, that lamb was to be selected on the 10th day of the first month. That's important to remember. The lamb was to be a young male without blemish. Now, they had 5 days to continue to inspect the lamb to make sure it was without blemish, and they likely grew very attached to it. Wouldn't you think so? Allow me to digress for just a moment. You can stop taking your notes for a few minutes here if you want to. I have a story I want to tell you. About 5 weeks ago, we had 3 baby chicks hatch. Now, all 3 have survived the cold weather we had. Sometimes it was in the 20s or even the teens some nights. That's Fahrenheit for you guys that do Celsius. But they were okay thanks to their protective mother hen who took care of them, even in that bitter cold. But once, when it was very cold, the mother hen temporarily left her chicks. Now, my wife was afraid the mother had abandoned them and that it was too cold for them to survive without their mother. She's probably right. Now, it turned out this was very early in the morning, and I was still asleep. I was sound asleep. And suddenly, my wife came running into the house all excited. She was yelling my name, and I thought something was seriously wrong. Remember, I was still asleep. Well, she had those 3 tiny baby chickens in her hat. She handed the hat to me as I lay in the bed and told me not to let them get loose until she can find a way to keep them warm. Remember, I'm still half asleep here. Well, these were really cute little things. Have you ever seen little baby chickens? And despite them being in the cold, they actually were very warm at the time. I was trying to hang on to them, keep them kind of out of the hat. They kept peeking out around my hands, but I didn't let them escape. Well, not out of the top of the hat anyway. But I felt something under my shoulder. And one of them had somehow escaped under my arm. So, uh-oh, we're in trouble. Then the second one did the same thing. I was about to panic. I was afraid to turn over. I thought I might crush the little guys if I turned over. So, excuse me. Excuse me. I'm yelling for my wife. Fortunately, my wife showed back up about the time the baby chicks, well, they ran under my arm to hide from her. So when she showed back up to get them, they ran back under my arm. I guess they liked me better than her, right? Okay. Well, anyway. She gathered them up and took them back out to our hen house where she had set up a heat lamp to keep them warm. But by then, the mother hen was back and the heat lamp wasn't needed. Today, our chicks are still doing just fine. They're really cute, and it's easy to become attached to them. Now, we suspect that 2 of the 3 are male, meaning they'll be roosters. And not needing any more roosters, it was suggested if these 2 are indeed roosters, they'd be killed and eaten. But that would be very difficult. Very, very near impossible for me to do since I've grown very fond of them. And this reminded me of that innocent young lamb that the Israelites inspected for about 5 days. No doubt some of the Israelites would become fond of their little lamb, just like I have our baby chicks. And I suspect it made them very sad to sacrifice that young lamb that they'd been so close to for those 5 days. And of course, no doubt the same thing applied to those who were close to Jesus Christ, our Passover lamb, when he was crucified, of course, in a much more intense way. Let's get back to the characteristics of this lamb. We can resume taking notes again if you want. My story's done here. Anyway, they kept the lamb until the 13th day of the first month was over. The lamb was to be killed in the afternoon of the 14th. None of the lamb's bones were to be broken, and the body of that lamb was to be eaten after dark during the night of the 15th. The blood of those lambs was responsible for saving the firstborn after placing the blood of the lamb on their doorposts. But again, this was only a temporary reprieve from death. Eventually, all those Israelites that were saved died anyway. None of the animal sacrifices in the Old Testament could actually take away our sin. They were used to remind us of sin and the need for atonement. The Old Testament Passover also looked forward to the time in the future when the blood of another lamb could actually save us from death. But this time, it wouldn't be a temporary reprieve. The blood of this lamb could save us for good. The blood of this lamb can allow us and our loved ones to live for eternity. And we'll see that the Passover and the exit from Egypt to the ancient Israelites, the ones that they experienced, well, this also foreshadowed that much greater Passover that was yet to come. And we'll see that Jesus Christ fulfilled the Passover in every detail foreshadowed by those first Passover lambs, and fulfilled additional Bible prophecy as well. So next Sabbath, 1 week from today, we'll look at Jesus Christ as he became our Passover lamb as we continue to prepare for the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For the next week and a couple of days or so, it's time for all of us to prepare for the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, if we haven't started already. We need to remove the leaven from our homes and vehicles. We need to make sure that we have unleavened bread to eat for all 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We need to make ready for the Passover. We need to decide in some cases if we'll keep the Passover with others in, say, a local congregation or group, or if we'll keep it in our homes. If in our homes, we will, of course, need some unleavened bread, some wine, and basins and towels for the foot washing. And if we here at the Independent Church of God Seventh Day might be of assistance, please let us know. If you'd like to join us locally to observe the Passover this year, just give us a call. We'd love to have you. Now, we will be doing a pre-recording of a Passover service that will be posted on our website a few days before the Passover, in case anyone might want to use us for a service at home. I'll talk more about that next week. But I'd like to thank you all for your obedience to our Creator and your desire to become more like Him as we all strive to become good citizens of God's great and soon coming kingdom. I pray that we all prepare to have a very meaningful and a very inspirational experience as we begin this year's Holy Day cycle. Hope to see you all again next week when we look at our Passover lamb, Jesus Christ.